In the run-up to Captain America Brave New World, I had a question that I am sure many of you did as well. If Thaddeus Ross is going to be the new president of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, who are the old ones? Because in comics, you usually assume that unless otherwise stated, the president in Marvel Comics is the same as the one in the real world. There are plenty of what-if exceptions, like Doom being president in the 2099 timeline, or Apocalypse being president in the Age of Apocalypse timeline, but in the 616 universe, the president isn't usually much of a character. Part of it has to do with how the sliding scale of comics makes tying fictional events to historical figures just complicated. And then partially, it's because, let's be honest, sometimes the nice thing about comics, especially recently, is you don't always want to think about the real president. Comics can be a nice escape. By the way, DC is a completely different story. Lex Luthor was the president. It was a whole thing. And yes, in Marvel Comics, Captain America was president, but that was the Ultimate Universe. Also, because he was a big fan in the real world, Stephen Colbert ran for president in the Marvel Comics universe against Obama in 2008. This was as his Republican character. It was fun. But, and this was at least canon when it happened, Colbert won the popular vote, but Obama won the Electoral College, so Obama was the president in 2008. And that is the thing you know now. Anyway, when I was thinking about Ross, I realized that we have a couple of other canonical presidents in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Fictional characters who are never the protagonists of these stories, but are involved. So I wanted to make a video breaking down all of the presidents in the MCU. I'm going to cover both the canon presidents. These are presidents who are explicitly mentioned in the movies and shows, as well as the presidents we can figure out from context clues. And even though, technically, the MCU goes back as far as 5000 BC, we're going to start at the starting point of the MCU, 2008. We could just sort of assume that all the presidents up until there were exactly the same as they are in the real world. Also, corrections, jackals, I'm not going to count multiverse stuff. So none of the fictional presidents, like President McKenna from X2, or whoever this is in The Last Stand, or the real presidents, like Nixon in Days of Future Past, no Mutant Kennedy in the Days of Future Past promo material, and no Franklin Roosevelt from his incredible cameo in Amazing Spider-Man 2, where he is a full picture on Peter's wall. As if Peter thinks President Roosevelt killed his dad, and also, he needs to be able to see President Roosevelt's face at all times, because he's gonna show up in the back of a picture or something. Also, no Steve Rogers, even though he did appear to take the oath of office in one of the multiverses. So, I'm going to talk about who the president was, what their platform seemed to be, and how their term went. And just so we are very clear, some of this is taking some logical leaps, but I think it mostly holds up, and until Kevin makes some proclamation, I'm just going to assume it's true. So we start the MCU in 2008, funny enough, an election year. No hint of a president in Iron Man or the Incredible Hulk. But then in Iron Man 2, we get our first suggestion that the MCU presidents line up with the real world ones when Tony picks up a piece of Iron Man fan art in the style of the Obama 2008 Hope posters by Shepard Farley. And considering Tony's reaction is positive, it seems like Obama wins this election. So okay, Obama was elected in 2008. And Obama presided over a pretty hectic couple of years. A big defense contractor, Tony Stark, was kidnapped by terrorists, but then it turned out the terrorists were working for Tony's business partner and sort of father figure that Tony eventually killed. Then Tony comes out as Iron Man, some sort of superhero who makes it very clear in Iron Man 2 that he answers to no one. And then it turns out another defense contractor was secretly working with a Russian terrorist, and his drones almost destroyed a small part of Queens. Then you've got the Hulk incidents in Princeton and Harlem, all seemingly made worse by a loose cannon general who we will get to, and some magic hammer showed up in New Mexico, although it doesn't seem like it got the same attention as those other events. Also, the economy was probably having a rough time during the Obama MCU years, which are also presumably following the Bush years, which left America in a recession. But we never really see the results of Tony shuttering the weapons division of his enormous weapons company. How many defense contracts are canceled? How many jobs are lost? Entire towns that exist because factories there build part of the Jericho missiles. What happens to them? The Stark stock price is in free fall, and I assume Hammer, right on its heels, also collapses. Maybe Pepper is able to save Stark Industries in the long term, but markets prefer stability, and the Iron Man movies paint a picture of an incredibly unstable CEO. He's depressed, sort of an alcoholic, and if it couldn't get any worse for Tony, Elon Musk is there. This all culminates in the events of the Avengers, which expose your average Earthling to aliens for the first time, and this has to be pretty crazy. It gave Tony Stark PTSD, and he has an Iron Man suit. Imagine how that must affect a non-Iron Man suited citizen. And the day is saved by a team led by the anti-government industrialist. So I can see a world where Americans want a president who can get things under control. The CEOs, the Hulks, and the aliens. And since all of this happened under Obama's watch, he probably gets blamed and loses the 2012 election if he even seeks a second term. I want to touch on one other Obama question I see all the time. Did he approve the nuking of New York? Because that happened on his watch. Was it a decision he made? What do people think happened? And to answer that, we need to answer another question. Who are the TV screen guys? Apparently, Fury takes orders from something called the World Security Council. As we'll see in The Winter Soldier, this is a multi-government organization that has some jurisdiction over S.H.I.E.L.D., which is a little weird, considering S.H.I.E.L.D. is an arm of the US government. I think nearly everyone in it appears to be American, and the H stands for Homeland, but sure. The World Security Council members we meet in The Winter Soldier are Hawley, Yen, Singh, and Rockwell. Pierce is the secretary of the council, and according to the wiki, Hawley is British, Yen is Chinese, Singh is Indian, and Rockwell is American. The other council member who we see in Avengers but doesn't make it to the Winter Soldier is Gideon Malik, played by Powers Booth. He, like Pierce, turned out to secretly be Hydra, something we learned on the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show. So nowhere on that list did I mention the president or any specific liaison to the president. In fact, the council seems to operate independently of any one government. So I'm willing to bet that they didn't call Obama about bombing New York. Not that I don't think he could be convinced to do it under the circumstances, but the council seems to exist to make decisions that politicians may not want to. Now, let's say Obama did not launch the nuke. People still know a nuke was launched. The little kid draws it in Iron Man 3. Are there conspiracies that Obama secretly launched the nuke? I bet there would be. There were conspiracies in the real world that he was secretly born in Kenya. So why wouldn't your conspiracy theorist believe he planned this thing that actually happened in universe? And then, you're Obama, do you pretend you launched the nuke? Which is worse? You tried to nuke a city to stop an alien invasion, or there's some other secret organization in the US that can launch nukes without the president's approval? It's a tough spot to be in. And just one more reason why Obama is not getting a second term. And he is followed by Matthew Ellis. So this is the first canon MCU president. Matthew Ellis was introduced in Iron Man 3 and presided over the MCU from 2013 to 2017. He's never explicitly given a party affiliation, but for a reason that makes sense to me, which I will explain as we go, he's probably a Republican. He was played by William Sadler. It seems like Ellis came in as part of a new focus on security. After the events of Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor, and the Avengers, you can see how the country may be interested in a new approach to national defense, especially since up until this point, it didn't seem like organizations like S.H.I.E.L.D. are household names, since in Iron Man 1, Pepper, who's pretty on the ball, needs to have S.H.I.E.L.D. explained to her by Coulson. So even if people are being protected, they don't seem to know it. Ellis' focus on security is further clarified during his speech first seen in the trailer for Iron Man 3, where he says,
"You elected me on a single platform. I will defend this country at all costs."
So how did President Ellis' first term go? Really, really bad. Like, as bad as it could possibly go. Because first big political event Ellis needs to deal with is Iron Man 3, and it doesn't go great. There are string of bombings perpetrated by a terrorist who calls himself the Mandarin, and while the Mandarin set his sights on Tony Stark, Ellis keeps himself involved by getting turned into a punk on live TV and then getting kidnapped. We also learn from Killian that Ellis was involved in a cover-up of a tanker spill in 2011, leans Republican. But the big finale in the movie involves the Mandarin attempting to execute President Ellis live on camera. Now Tony, Rhodey, and Pepper save the day, and Ellis is not exploded, but the whole thing gets way worse when we learn that President Ellis was only able to be kidnapped because he was sold out by his own vice president, Rodriguez, who wanted to use extremists to get his daughter, played by Jenna Ortega, a new leg. So Ellis really messed that one up. Got turned into a punk and kidnapped by his vice president. Ellis does not play nearly as direct a role in the rest of his term as MCU president, but there are several other notable events that reflect pretty poorly on his administration. First one, the government is filled with secret Nazis, including much of S.H.I.E.L.D. and at least one senator. This comes after a week where Captain America was deemed an enemy of the state, and then 3 evil helicarriers powered by an AI rose out of the Potomac and targeted many dangerous individuals, including President Ellis. So this was the second time in his administration that someone attempted to assassinate President Ellis specifically, and only failed because Ellis was saved by an Avenger. And how does President Ellis repay the Avengers? Well, after an Avengers mission goes badly overseas, the US, along with hundreds of other nations, make Avengering illegal. And this effort is spearheaded by Ellis's apparent Secretary of State, Thunderbolt Ross. Ross gives the Avengers the good news, they split up, Ross takes half of them to the raft, and then they're all broken out. So Ellis accomplished basically nothing to create a big rift between the Avengers right before the next alien invasion. Ellis is also a big player in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., although that definitely doesn't sync up with the MCU by this point, because the global event Ellis deals with poorly there is the Inhuman Crisis, where many people exposed to Terrigen mists are given wonderful inhuman powers like melting stuff. And Ellis created something called the ATCU, Advanced Threat Containment Unit, to round up all of these Inhumans. It eventually fell apart, and Coulson and the team fixed everything. I think it's been a while since I've seen that show. Either way, it doesn't count towards the MCU, but not great on Ellis's part. So that is Matthew Ellis, 2013 to 2017. Now here's where it gets screwy, because yes, unfortunately, it certainly seems like Donald Trump won the 2016 election in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There are not as many direct references to Trump as you would expect. In fact, they really only come from the Netflix stuff, which is becoming more canon by the day. But Trump presents a problem. Ellis took over for Obama. At the time, Obama was a one-term Democrat, which would lead you to believe that Ellis is a Republican, since it is very unusual for a party to primary a sitting president. But then Trump is also a Republican, which means either Ellis is a Democrat who primaried Obama, or Trump primaried Ellis. And personally, I think the idea of Ellis being immediately kidnapped and clowned on by the Mandarin would suggest he's pretty unpopular by the end of his first term, so I think it's way more plausible that in 2016 there was a Republican primary that acted as a referendum on Ellis, which Trump won. And yes, once the Russo brothers were asked if Donald Trump was president in the MCU, and they answered, "Oh God, I don't know. If he was, it would literally take over the Marvel Universe." But we have no other information to go by, so I'm going to say Trump probably was president in the MCU. Which means, in 2018, Thanos snapped half of all life out of existence, and I have no idea what that means for the MCU governments. Like sure, if the president got snapped, then the vice president takes over. We have a line of succession. But what happens if the vice president's spouse and kids all got snapped? Can the vice president devote their full attention to being president, or do they resign? And then how far down do you have to go before you find someone who is both not snapped and not emotionally devastated by the snap? So what do? We don't know. But most MCU historians who are asked this question point to a gap. Some time where we had an interim president but also wanted to set up new elections, and by 2022, a new president was elected. Whether this was because the old one was snapped or stepped down, who knows? But the Trump administration is over, and in 2023, the Ritson administration begins. I will say I want to make a little update, because there is another YouTuber who made a similar video. Their channel is a bit of everything. That's not the description for the channel, that's what the channel is called. And they made 3 videos so far about the presidents in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, also talking about the presidents that come before all of this happened, historical figures, but talking about the presidents in the MCU. They have a different thought about what happens in the Blip that I like. I think their thought is cool. But without going into all the details, they basically think that when the Blip happens, everybody comes back to life, and they hold a new election because they're like, well, we didn't vote for the guy. If Joe Biden, say, won the presidency, a lot of people come back from the dead and are like, well, we should get to vote on who's the president now because we weren't here before. I like that theory. I think that theory is clever, and also I think something like that makes sense. My only problem with it is that the years don't make sense to me. Apparently, people think that the Blip happened in October of 2023. That's when everyone came back. The Captain America Brave New World takes place in 2027, which means the election of President Ross was probably in 2026. So if everybody comes back in 23, why doesn't that term last 4 years? Because let's say they do like a really quick election in 2023, a 4-year term would end in 2027, which is why it feels like there just has to be chaos for a bunch of years. And then in 2022, we just have an election that is like, finally, we're gonna start fresh. We're gonna try again. So many people have resigned. We got to do something, whatever. There would also just be like a legal disaster. I'm sure there'd be a lot of reasons why the 3 years between 2018 and 2021, like those could be just chaos. And then by 2022, we have a new president. That's Ritson. They serve to 2026. That is my theory. But either way, I will link the A Bit of Everything video about the MCU presidents in the description here. Go watch that. It is a great video. That is the only explanation I've ever heard for what happens in the Blip that I like. But then that's the only reason it didn't quite fit for me. Okay, back to the regular video. So we don't know much about James Ritson either, less even than Matthew Ellis, but he is the second canon president in the MCU. The first big event Ritson needed to deal with was the Blip, because in 2023, the missing half of all life in the universe reappeared, and this clearly caused problems. Organizations were formed, like the Global Repatriation Council, which worked to resettle snapped people and deport refugees who immigrated during the snap. This was a disaster, but Ritson managed to keep his distance from it since the GRC was a worldwide organization, and it seemed like this man was the representative for the US. He is known only as government official, and he took part in both the GRC activities and everything related to the new Captain America, John Walker. Now, this man was working under Ritson for sure, but we didn't even hear Ritson's name until years later, so he isn't tied to these events the same way that Ellis was. Our first explicit Ritson reference comes in Wakanda Forever, where we see on a CNN crawl that Ritson signed a trade deal with the new Asgardians. We also learn that he is interested in getting control of the Wakandan vibranium via destabilization, although this information comes from Val, who is already an unreliable source of information. I could see a world where she's overstating Ritson's involvement to justify her own actions as CIA director. But speaking of that, I do want to take some time in this video to focus on some other countries in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, lest you think America is especially crazy. Like, sure, we have more superpowered people, but the rest of the world is as chaotic, maybe worse. Let's take 3 of the countries we seem to see a lot of. We never learn who is in charge of Sokovia during the run of the MCU. It is described by Zemo as a failed state long before the Avengers got there, and by Maria Hill as nowhere special on its way to everywhere special. It seems like Sokovia has always been a powder keg for most of at least Wanda's life, maybe Zemo's. Novigrad, the country's capital city, was bombed by the US Air Force, an event that killed Wanda and Pietro's parents and radicalized them against the US military, and specifically Tony Stark. We learned that Sokovia became the last refuge of Hydra after the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then, in Avengers Age of Ultron, Novigrad is destroyed by Ultron, and the country is destabilized to the point of no longer being able to maintain its sovereignty, and its land is split up amongst the neighboring countries. Not great. Then let's take a look at a real country, France, because they go the other way with it. France comes up a couple of times in the MCU. It's where Vanko is held prisoner, some Flag Smasher stuff happens there probably, but in Wakanda Forever, France decides to attack a Wakandan outreach center in Mali to steal its vibranium. They are caught and humiliated by Queen Ramonda, so okay, France gets caught trying to steal metals, which leads to Wakanda isolating itself a second time. But then, for some reason in Brave New World, France is one of the countries along with the US, India, and Japan that are handling the discovery of adamantium. Now obviously, America makes sense because we have all the superheroes. India and Japan, sure, they are at least near the Indian Ocean where the Celestial Island apparently sits. But France, the country that just got in trouble for trying to steal the last miracle mineral, is apparently part of the committee to mine the new one. And then third, speaking of that, I want to talk about Wakanda, because they seem like they got their shit together. They must have a more stable government than the US, right? Wrong. In fact, Wakanda may have the least stable government in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Starting in 2016, during the superhuman civil war, you have a king who is assassinated. Within weeks, his son, the new king, is killed in a challenge for leadership that comes from an up until now secret prince who wants to declare war on the rest of the world. Okay, but that guy loses within like a day and T'Challa's back in power. Some stability? No. 2 years later, in 2018, Thanos shows up, kills lots of Wakandans, and snaps away half of all life in the universe, including the new king and his sister, who would be next in line. So then their mother, Queen Ramonda, takes over. But 5 years later, in 2023, everyone who was snapped is brought back to life, meaning T'Challa, the king, has returned and takes over as leader. But then within a year in 2024, he dies from something completely unrelated to all of this. And his mother, Ramonda, takes over again. A year later, she is also killed by another king who nobody but the Wakandans know exists, and her daughter Shuri becomes the new ruler of Wakanda. So within 10 years, it goes T'Chaka, T'Challa, Killmonger, T'Challa, Ramonda, Shuri. That is 7 changes in leadership. For reference, England has had 5 different monarchs in the last 100 years. But are the other parts of Wakanda going well? No! First of all, T'Challa reveals that Wakanda exists to the world in 2016, although in 10 years, it does not seem like anyone can travel to Wakanda, and there doesn't seem to be much trade because the country's most well-known resource, vibranium, remains highly guarded because of international relations falling apart. Also, the country continues to suffer mass casualty events. It is unclear how many died in the battle between T'Challa and Killmonger, but those numbers pale in comparison to the deaths when Wakanda gets involved in the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Wakanda suffers huge losses at the Battle of Wakanda during the events of Infinity War, where Wakanda alone is forced to stand against 3 members of the Black Order and a nearly endless army of Outriders. Wakandans also make up a large part of the infantry at the Battle of Avengers Compound during Endgame, and then Namor and the Talokanil fled the entire capital city, killing many warriors and presumably far more civilians. Wakanda continues to suffer catastrophic losses through the events of phases 3 and 4, while vibranium is stolen by poachers like Claw, the world government, and is about to be replaced by the discovery of adamantium. Starting in 2016, living in Wakanda is a nightmare. Anyway, because the scope of the MCU gets smaller and bigger, we get less exposure to Ritson over phases 4 and 5 than you might expect. We saw the rise of Sword and Damage Control as answers to superhuman threats that turned somewhat authoritarian, although again, it's tough to pin that on Ritson since changes at both organizations were driven by directors with agendas. However, it's hard not to see a pattern forming. As they say, personnel is policy. The Ritson government is very anti-superpowers, and that all comes to a head in Secret Invasion. Secret Invasion is the first time we actually see James Ritson in person. He's played by Dermot Mulroney, and this is where we get to see his policies in action. And they do tend to line up with the rest of the MCU government during Ritson's tenure. Ritson originally does not seem to be aware of the Skrull invasion, which is odd considering his government contained so many intelligence and security officials who would be all over an invading alien force, but turns out they're all preoccupied with jailing the Avengers. And on a meta level, I have a feeling it doesn't add up, because Secret Invasion came out of nowhere and wasn't incredibly thought through. But anyway, Ritson does eventually learn about the Skrull invasion, but unbeknownst to him, he is being advised by James Rhodes, who is at this point, and probably has been for a while, a Skrull in disguise. It seems like this was the case since Civil War, although that usually leads to some question like, hey, wait, what about, don't worry about it. Anyway, Skrull Rhodey, or Scrody, tries to get Ritson to attack Russia to start a war which only Skrulls will be able to survive. Luckily, Fury and Sonya Falsworth stop Scrody and save Ritson. And even though earlier, Ritson's life was saved by a Skrull, and he has pretty much completely foiled the evil Skrull's plans, Ritson still goes on TV to do one of the most unhinged things in the entire MCU. And keep in mind, your average Earthling does not know that the Skrulls exist. Maybe after the events of Captain Marvel, there are some people with fringe theories, but for the most part, green shape-shifting aliens are not on everybody's radar. It's unclear how much information got out about the attack on Ritson's motorcade, but I can't imagine you'd see that and go alien shapeshifters before new kinds of super soldier or demon or whatever. And President Ritson goes on TV to tell the public that not only do Skrulls exist, but they have infiltrated every level of our society. But don't worry, the government knows who they are, and they're going to designate all off-world born species enemy combatants. And then he point blank just says he's going to kill them. Doesn't tell them to leave or surrender, just that the government is going to get you. Now, I'm not going to be the first person to point out some of the flaws in this declaration. Fury himself calls Ritson to explain that Ritson's address was insane. Fury says this kind of announcement will lead to paranoia that will get innocent people and Skrulls killed. Especially because Ritson does not announce a hotline or designate any specific government agency. He's just like, watch out, somebody's coming. And also, Ritson doesn't give people any more information about the Skrulls, like how to find out if someone is or is not a Skrull. So Ritson basically said, there are alien species everywhere and they all want to do bad stuff, so we're at war with them. If you think you know one, just do whatever. Kidnap them, kill them yourself, it's war, right? Go nuts. And while Fury is explaining this to Ritson, we see footage of people taking the law into their own hands, and it goes down honestly better than you'd expect, considering it starts with a bunch of armed militia types gunning down a Tucker Carlson type broadcaster live on air, but it turns out he was one of the secret aliens. So that is an alien invasion worst case scenario. They control the media. We see another vigilante going after the Prime Minister of the UK, who it turns out is not an alien, and then some Skrull hunters get katana'd by someone. I don't know if we're supposed to recognize this character. Cool. But more importantly, neither Fury nor Ritson seems to understand what all off-world born species actually means, because it would obviously include the Asgardians, including Thor and Valkyrie, Hulk's new Hulk son, almost all of the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Eternals, Goose the Flurkin, I'm going to say Shang-Chi and anyone descended from the residents of Ta Lo, since it's from another dimension or something. This guy, Rintrah, all the other gods like Hercules and Bast, symbiotes, this duck, and the Watchers. We are going to war with all of them. So like this light elf from She-Hulk. She's going to Fort Knox until she, talks? About what? She's just a light elf. She doesn't have an agenda. So what does any of this mean? Luckily, the show was poorly received, so we'll never need to think about it again. Even the Marvels, that had Skrulls in it, does not bring any of this up. So it might as well not count. But Ritson does. And I think he's so interesting as a political figure because of the disconnect between what he does and how it feels like that would be perceived. Fury says,
"That's real one-term president stuff."
And then we'll see that Ritson indeed either chose not to run a second time, was primaried, or just lost the general election to Ross. So he was a one-term president. But in my opinion, just kind of thinking about what actually happens on the show, the president declared war against a race of aliens that actually secretly lived among us. Forget about whether or not they're all bad. Obviously they aren't, but they exist. And one got shot on live TV. It feels like, to me, a president who acts aggressively towards those aliens would be pretty popular. After all, in the comics, after the secret invasion, Norman Osborn was able to use the fear that your average Marvelian felt as a tool in his rise to power. And in American politics, wartime presidents tend to keep power. After 9/11, Bush got a huge bump in popularity, peaking at 90%, which feels impossible. It wasn't until the war fell apart and the Great Recession that Bush's approval plummeted, but that took a while. And we weren't doing a great job in Afghanistan or Iraq. It wasn't like that war was ever really a success. Ritson had a war against an enemy that was on American soil, which was originally led by one guy with an axe to grind. An army that had a weapon of mass destruction, not that they were going to use it in the future, but Gravik created a Super Skrull machine. And Ritson himself was seriously injured in a terrorist attack. Fury. Do I think Ritson giving the speech is good? Absolutely not. But I think running on an I'm going to kill all the Skrulls platform in a world where the Skrulls exist, and we're at least, for a little bit, trying to take over the world, is going to be an incredibly successful political strategy. But whatever. Apparently, Ritson loses his re-election bid to the third canon MCU president, Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross, who, spoilers for Captain America Brave New World, was president for 3 months in 2027, the year Brave New World takes place. He then turned into a big red Hulk, destroyed the White House, and then stepped down from his office as president. Ross runs on a platform of togetherness, and I'd have to assume security since he was previously a general and secretary of state. And even though Ross served under what I'm assuming is the Republican Matthew Ellis, I'm not convinced he is also a Republican. Like, sure, I can see a world where Ritson was a Democrat who followed Trump, and then Ross is a Republican who followed Ritson. But I can also see a world where Ross is one of those never-Trump Republicans who switches parties or maybe even runs as an independent. And while he seems to actually step down because he turned into a big red Hulk monster and destroyed the White House, his 3-month presidency is, like the rest of these guys, a disaster. In Brave New World, we learn that for the last decade or so, Ross has been holding Samuel Stearns prisoner and dousing him with more gamma radiation so that Stearns can work for Ross, mainly on pills to control Ross's heart condition. After the assassination attempt, it becomes clear to Ross that Stearns is up to something. He hired the Serpent Society, he's hypnotizing people in Ross's orbit, and Ross could, at any point, just tell the public, or even just Sam, what's going on and put a stop to all of this. But that would potentially expose Ross's weird situation with Stearns, and his daughter wouldn't love him anymore, so he doesn't do that. Instead, one guard is killed by the leader, several former hypnotized security guards are killed by another hypnotized security guard, D-Man is killed by Stearns, Sidewinder probably kills some cops, all the Hulk business happens, and more importantly, Ross almost starts a hot war with Japan. All because he does not want to admit he's doing bad guy stuff. So yeah, pretty awful presidenting, especially since the only reason everything doesn't go sideways is because Sam Wilson keeps intervening, which Ross keeps trying to stop. So Ross is in the raft for Hulk stuff and more importantly for being a compromised agent of a supervillain. And Ross's vice president ascended to the presidency. And even though this is a movie where the president steps down, we never get so much as a peek at Ross's VP. But whoever that person is, they are the president now. In conclusion, being the president of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a terrible job that ruins your life. That's true in the real world too, but it is double true when your assailants are body-snatching aliens and molten tech CEOs. And the three men who have done the job on screen have done it exceptionally poorly. But speaking of things to have on screen, you know what's an awesome thing for screens? Nebula. Oh, Nebula. We're talking about Nebula. Nebula is a subscription streaming service that I helped to create. Supporting Nebula is the best way to support this channel. All my videos go up early, ad-free. For videos on Nando V Movies, maybe a month early. A lot of it depends on the production schedule, but you will see my videos before anybody else sees them. There's also all kinds of great Nebula original content like Jet Lag, but also documentaries and also, fiction stuff that we're working on. I'll probably talk more about that soonish. And just go to Nebula, look around, you'll find cool stuff by cool people. Abolish Everything, I love that. I was at a taping of one of those. I don't think the one that I went to the taping of has come out yet, but when it is out, you'll be able to see me in the audience and go, he was at that. So that was fun. I haven't performed, but I was in the audience at it, which is kind of performing. You're laughing and clapping and stuff, and you're part of the show as far as I'm concerned. And a year of Nebula is already a steal at $60, which is like $5 a month. But if you go to go.nebula.tv/Nando, you can get a year Nebula for $36. That is $3 a month. It is an incredible deal. Go to go.nebula.tv/Nando. You'll be happy that you did. As always, thank you to everybody who continues to support the channel on Patreon. Thank you to everybody who listens to my podcast, Mostly Nitpicking, and everybody that follows me on social media. I'm Nando V Movies everywhere. That's all I got. Stay safe. I'll see you next time.